Today, we're going to talk about something pretty dark: the hunger plan. Now, this isn't just a story about the hardships of war. It's about how an entire bureaucracy was weaponized, designed with cold, meticulous precision to murder millions of people through starvation. Yeah, let's just get this out of the way right up front. The goal of this plan was to deliberately starve 30 million human beings. It's a number that's almost impossible to wrap your head around. And it wasn't dreamt up on a battlefield. It was conceived in quiet offices by men in suits. So you gotta ask, right? How on earth does something as basic as food policy, farming, supply, distribution, get twisted into a weapon of genocide? Well, to figure that out, we have to look at how it got tangled up with an ideology of conquest. And it all kicks off with a national trauma that haunted Germany for years. Believe it or not, the origins of this horrific plan don't really start with military strategy. They start with a memory, a ghost, a deep, collective fear of hunger that was baked into the German psyche. The key phrase you have to know here is Turnipwinter, or Kohlrubenwinter. See, back in World War I, Germany was hit with devastating food shortages. People were literally forced to live on turnips, which, by the way, were usually animal feed. This experience left a deep, deep scar, a powerful, shared memory of what it felt like to be hungry and vulnerable as a nation. And this is where it gets really clever, in a sinister kind of way. The Nazi Party got incredibly good at exploiting this trauma. Food self-sufficiency, Nahrungsfreiheit, wasn't just a policy point, it was a core promise. Their propaganda, with slogans like "No more turnips," spoke directly to that national fear. They were basically saying, "We'll never let that happen to you again." They weren't just selling policy, they were selling a cure for a national wound. And you can see this play out in the actual election results. It's fascinating, really. Their whole focus on farming and food really worked with voters in rural Protestant areas, places that had been hit hard by the economic crisis. I mean, in some of these regions, the Nazi vote shot past 50%. But it's a totally different story in Catholic areas. They had their own support systems through the church and pretty much resisted the Nazi message. Okay, so you've got the fear, the political fuel, but you still need someone to build the engine. Every plan needs an architect, and for the hunger plan, that architect was an incredibly ambitious, ruthless, and scarily effective bureaucrat named Herbert Backe. And this guy, Doc, he didn't waste any time climbing the ladder. He got in with the party early, sure, but what made him so valuable was his expertise in agriculture and just being good at running things. He helped set up this huge organization called the Reich Food Estate, started the battle for production to make Germany self-sufficient, and by 1936, he'd maneuvered himself into a super powerful position. He was a key guy getting Germany ready for war. To really get a sense of who Backe was, it helps to compare him to his old boss, Richard Walther Darré. Darré was the big ideas guy, the ideologue with this mystical blood and soil philosophy. Backe, he was the opposite. He was a cold, hard pragmatist. All he cared about were efficiency and results. And that, right there, is what made him so much better at turning the party's twisted ambitions into a real, workable, and absolutely horrific plan. All right, so this is where we get to the plan itself. And this is the point where we cross a very, very dark line. From just agricultural policy to a full-blown blueprint for mass murder. It was all designed to clear out Eastern Europe to make room for German settlers, the whole Lebensraum idea. The plan was just brutally, horribly simple. It split the Soviet Union into two zones. First, you had the surplus zone, which was basically the breadbasket of Ukraine. All the food from there would be stolen to feed Germany. Then you had the deficit zone up north. The planners decided it wasn't productive, and so the people there, who they saw as inferior, would simply be walled off from any supplies and deliberately, intentionally starve to death. And you can actually point to a single day, a single meeting, where this whole thing went from being a terrible theory to an agreed-upon plan for murder. It all happened on May 2nd, 1941, in Berlin, just a few weeks before the invasion of the Soviet Union. And when you read the notes from that meeting, man, it's just bone-chilling. They weren't using code words or anything. The official memo says, "Many tens of millions of people in this region will become superfluous and will die or have to migrate to Siberia." Superfluous. That was the language they used for genocide, right there in a bureaucratic document. And once that decision was made, the bureaucracy just kicked into high gear. It's actually terrifying how fast it all happened. Less than 2 weeks later, Hitler signs off on it personally. By the end of May, it's written into official economic policy. And then, just a few days before the invasion, this green folder gets sent out, making the hunger plan official state policy. It went from an idea to law in just over a month.
So they had the plan, it was official policy. What happened when they actually tried to do it? Let's take a look at how it was carried out, why it technically failed to hit its insane target, and the absolutely devastating legacy it left behind.
Now, the plan failed to kill its target of 30 million, and I'm putting failed in massive air quotes here because it wasn't for a lack of trying. The biggest problem for them was that the blitzkrieg didn't work. The war just dragged on, which totally wrecked their logistics. They just didn't have enough soldiers to seal off those huge deficit zones. And Soviet civilians were incredibly resilient. They started black markets, foraged for food, anything to survive. The plan was a monster, but it was built on a really flawed idea, that the war would be over in a few weeks. But let's be very, very clear about what failure means in this context. Because even though it was only partially implemented, the results were an absolute catastrophe. German food policies were directly responsible for the deaths of somewhere between 4 and 7 million Soviet citizens. It's just a tragedy on an incomprehensible scale.
And what about the architect, Herbert Backe? After the war, locked up in Nuremberg. Did he have any regrets? Not a single one. In a letter he wrote to his wife, he was still defending National Socialism, even calling it one of the greatest ideas of all time. He ended up taking his own life in his cell before his trial, apparently still believing in his monstrous work right to the very end.
The story of the hunger plan is, well, it's a lot, but it's such a stark reminder of how normal-seeming things like bureaucracy and ideology can be twisted into tools for unimaginable evil. And it leaves us with a really critical question for today. How are food justice and access to food still being used as tools of power and control in our world right now? It's a sobering thought for sure, and one we really need to keep in mind.